Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Beth. I'm the executive director here because I see some faces I don't recognize. So special double welcome and special, if it's your first time here, we really appreciate your coming. We do have brown bag lunches, usually every month on the second Wednesday. But one of the things I want to announce is there isn't one in May. We are having this other little event called the Penn Dry Goods Market on May 15th or 16th and 17th, excuse me, the Friday and Saturday of that week. And we hope you come to that instead. I also want to take a moment to announce the June topic, however. On June 11th, we are going to have back Alice Wolfgang again. She did a great program for us on pies last summer. And continuing in thinking about Pennsylvania German foods, she'll be talking about the odd and even awful, OFFAL, Pennsylvania German foods. So if you're like me, you're going to have to come and figure out what that title means. But we do hope to see you then. Today we have a special treat. Our speaker is Emma Hartman, who is a research associate that we were fortunate enough to be able to hire for a year with a grant from the Philadelphia Funder Collaborative for the Semi-Quincentennial. This is a grant that we got in conjunction with our partners, the Historical Society of Montgomery County, to do research about who lived in the Perkiomen Valley around the time that the Schwenkfelders first came here and up through the American Revolutionary period. Emma has a master's in library science from the University of Illinois, and we share her as an employee. She also works as the community outreach associate with the Northampton, County Historical and Genealogical Society. So we're really fortunate to have her with us today. I will ask for the next hour that you turn off your phones. If you have questions, you save them to the end. And if you're joining us by Zoom, use the Q&A feature to type your questions in, and we'll be sure they get answered at the end too. And so with that, Emma.
Hi. So as Beth mentioned, I was hired through a grant from the Philadelphia Funder Collaborative for the Semi-Quincentennial. So for the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration. And I've been working on this project since July. So I still have a couple more months left of research. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of preliminary findings. So stay tuned because there will be updates and more to come about this project. And I just wanted to start off with a little bit of project background. As Beth mentioned, we were trying to figure out exactly who lived and worked in the Perkiomen Valley from 1730 when the Schwenkfelders arrived through, we bookended about 1830, but I'll kind of explain a little bit why in a minute. And we were looking for telling more a complete and accurate story of what this region was like during the Revolution, and noticed there was a lack, particularly of stories about African Americans in the community. And so that's really where a lot of this research focuses on both free and enslaved African Americans during this time period. And this kind of myth that Pennsylvania Germans didn't own slaves, there was no African American population in this area. A lot of people think because of the 1688 Quakertown protest that Pennsylvania German Quakers petitioned against enslavement, that Pennsylvania Germans and Quakers were always anti-slavery, and that's not the case, as we found through this research. And you'll see today through my findings, there was actually a substantial African-American population in this area. So here's just, maybe. There we go. Kind of an overview of where we're heading today. I want to split this talk. I know there's 5 bullet points up here, but essentially in 2 of talking about the research methods and how we research these underdocumented populations and unheard stories. And then the second half kind of sharing some of those stories and some of those findings. And then of course, what we don't know and what we're still looking to find and where this research is going, because as I said, research is always an ongoing process. So I first want to situate us geographically of where are we, other than the Perkiomen Valley is kind of a vague term, it's a broad term. So the townships in red are the townships that we're highlighting for this study. So that includes Upper Hanover, East Greenville, Pennsburg, Red Hill, Douglas Township, New Hanover, Marlborough, Upper and Lower Frederick, Upper and Lower Salford, Skippack, Schwenksville, Towmenson, Worcester, Douglas, Hereford, and Long Swamp on the Berks County side, as well as Washington Township technically, but it wasn't a township during the time of the study. So, and then in yellow here, you see Perkiomen Township, as well as the Pottstown and Pottsgrove area. So those areas are not identified as specifically regions we wanted to focus on in this study, but historically would have been part of Douglas and New Hanover for the Pottstown and Pottsgrove area, and part of Skipback for Perkiomen Township. So they're kind of included by default, because when you're looking at sources and documents, it's really hard to tell exactly a lot of times where on that kind of dividing line different things fall. And because especially the Pottstown and Pottsgrove area is so economically important for the region due to the iron forges and furnaces there, that you kind of have to include it when you're telling the story about what life was like in this area. Now that we know where we are, when are we in time? So 1730, as Beth mentioned, is Schwenkfelder arrival in America. So that's kind of where we're starting this study. And then 1830 is give or take the end of enslavement in Pennsylvania. There is some enslavement into the 1840s in Pennsylvania, but because of the Gradual Abolition Act in 1780, that's really starting to die off. So in the middle here, we have obviously 1776, the Declaration and the Revolution, but we also have, as another kind of crucial midpoint in this study, is the 1780 Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery. So what is that and what does it mean? So basically in 1780, this act was passed, and although it's an act for abolition, this act did not actually free any enslaved persons. So what the act said was basically by November 1st, 1780, if you were an enslaver, you had to register every enslaved person that you had, and you had to register them with their name, their age, your name, and where you lived and what your job was. So you don't get a lot of information from these registers, but we do know then exactly how many people are enslaved and by whom. And if you didn't register somebody that you had, then they were automatically manumitted or freed. And this act also, because it's gradual abolition, set up a clause that anyone born after that November 1st, 1780 date was enslaved rather than for life for a term of 28 years. And so nobody is freed in 1780 by this act, but it is a crucial kind of start to abolition in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania was the first state to pass an act like this. Other states, New Jersey, New York, shortly followed after in subsequent years. So it is kind of this landmark date. And as I mentioned, there are registers of enslaved persons from this act. We do not have one for, well, Montgomery County would have been part of Philadelphia County still in 1780. And then Berks County, both of those registers have been lost. So we do not have that data. There's a partial transcription of the Berks County register, but there is no complete data set for Philadelphia. Recently, the Northampton County register was uncovered by Scott Gordon at the Historical Society of Philadelphia. So there is hope that it is out there somewhere, but we don't have that data at this time, unfortunately. If you're interested in what they look like, there are available online scans of the registers that are available. Chester County has a really great website that has their register on it. So definitely take a look if that's something you're interested in, but unfortunately that's data we don't have. So what data do we have? Kind of going to go through and talk about some different source types and how we do research with them and how they fit together. So really the foundation where I started with this project all the way back in July was with tax records. So obviously it's tax season right now. We're all thinking about taxes. Our taxes look a little bit different. We're not paying taxes on horses and sheep, most of us. But what do they tell us? So the one on the right is a page of a more complete tax list. And then on the left here, I have two kind of zoom in on individuals. So these are lists of all of the taxable inhabitants in a particular township or municipality. And these really vary over time. There's various types of taxes. Most of them were used to fund things like the Revolutionary War, but they really are not consistent over time. Most of the taxes that I used were on microfilm at the Historical Society of Montgomery County. So really easy to drive down to Norristown and pull out those microfilm reels and look through pages and pages of tax records if that's the kind of thing you're interested in, which I can attest they're very dry. I mean, as you can see, it's a lot of statistical data that you don't really get a person's story from. But we do get from them is an idea of who the enslavers were in various areas at various times. Because as you can see from the examples on the left here, Michael Kroll, he is taxed for one Negro, which is the term that they would have used to describe an enslaved person at the time. Occasionally, you'll also see the term mulatto, which would have been used for a mixed race person. Obviously, these are not the terms we would use today, and also 18th century conceptions of race are not quite the same way we think of them today, but those are kind of the words and terms you will see throughout the sources because that's what would have been used at the time. So we know that Michael Kroll had one enslaved person who was worth 75 pounds because it still would have been, even though it's post-revolution, currency is changing and not consistent throughout the early republic. So you will still see things in pounds rather than dollars in a lot of these early records. And we also know that Michael Kroll was a shopkeeper because this tax list lists occupations. Not all of them do, but many of them do. So we can learn a little bit about his enslaved person. We don't know how old they were, whether they were male or female, but we do know they were probably working in Michael Kroll's shop. Whereas below him, Jacob Reef is a farmer. So his enslaved persons, which he has two, and this time they do list the age. He has a 43-year-old and a 14-year-old. They are probably performing some kind of agricultural labor because Jacob Reef's a farmer. And then I also wanted to point out on the undated tax list, you can see Samuel Pennepacker, who is also a farmer. He is taxed for one servant. So the tax lists kind of vary in the language they use, but this one we can pretty safely say this is an indentured servant, so possibly someone of German heritage who is paying off a debt to essentially for their passage from Europe to Pennsylvania. And we can tell that it's almost certainly an indentured servant because on the same list, Joseph Pauling is taxed for two Negroes. So sometimes a list will only list servants and they won't use that term Negro at all. In that case, it becomes a little bit more difficult to tell exactly what they're talking about because the terms slave and servant, while not interchangeable, were often substituted for each other in certain sources. So these are a great starting point because I have a spreadsheet essentially put together tracking exactly every year who's being taxed and where are they living and how many people are they being taxed for. And they are, like I said, super accessible at the Historical Society. However, there are some limitations to these records. Tax records only show able-bodied enslaved people between approximately the ages 12 and 50. If you had someone younger than that, older than that, or who was injured and couldn't work, they were not considered taxable property because they weren't considered as valuable. You weren't using their labor. So you get kind of a consistent undercounting of your enslaved population through these records. If you have like an enslaved family, say you might see the parents being taxed, but not younger children. Additionally, Montgomery County wasn't formed until 1783, so earlier tax records would have been in Philadelphia County. They're not as easy to research. They're fragmented, scattered, so you don't have as complete of a data set. That being said, this is still an incredible source that, especially the ability to track over time, because taxes are every year, unlike census records, which are every 10 years, and you have large gaps between when you can find a person in the records. This is every single year. But census records are another incredible source. So the first United States Census was 1790. So obviously for much of the study, 1730, 1830, those first 60 years, we're not getting census data. So a lot of this is much later in the study. It's post-revolution, post-gradual emancipation. So you're getting a very different type of data. So I showed here what the blank form for the 1800 census looks like and an example of what that actually looks like in Douglas Township. So as you can see, almost all of the categories for the 1800 census are for white people. You have your head of family, you have free white males by age, kind of in these blockings, and the same thing for free white females. But all other free persons not taxed is one category. So if you are a free Black person, doesn't matter whether you're a man, woman, if you're 4 years old or 40 years old, you're being lumped into that same category. And then same thing for enslaved persons. So it's very difficult to get kind of these family breakdowns or really any idea of what that population looked like other than that it existed. So on the census form, I highlighted 2 individuals that are really interesting ways that you can kind of counter what it looks like in these census records. So the first one, David Adley. You can see all of the categories are blank until you get to that all other free persons. So we know that David is living in a household of 2, possibly with a wife, but it could be child or it could be a brother. We don't know who he's living with, but he's considered the head of a household of 2 free people of color. So we know right there that David Adley is a person of color. So we get his name, even though we don't really get any other information about him from the census records. Whereas if you look down to Joseph Bicking, he has a number of white people in his household. He has a very large household of 9, 10, 11, 12, over 15 people, including 1 free person of color. So we don't know what that relationship to Joseph was, whether this was somebody who he had hired to work for him, who had been formerly enslaved and stayed with the family, if this was someone he had some kind of relationship with. We don't know, other than that they are living in the same household in 1800. And it's important to note also that the census records and the tax records, even in the years when we have both, such as 1800, 1810, don't always agree and line up in information. And so there's a number of reasons why this could be. It could be your tax assessor was lazy and missed somebody when they were taxing, or it could be your census taker somebody was out of town or sick and didn't answer when the census taker was around, and so they're missing from the census. So it's important to cross-check as many sources as we can. But there's always going to be gaps, and we kind of have to fill in as best we can. Eventually, the census records do start to show more of a breakdown. 1820, you get the same age groupings as you do for white people, so that under 10 years old, et cetera. And then eventually by 1850, we get the census kind of as it looks today, where you get enumerations for every single person in a household with their names and age at the time. So the records change over time and are not consistent, but eventually we do get more data. There's also a different type of census that I looked at called the septennial census. So this was done every 7 years. So we have it in 1793, 1800, 1807. And these kind of supplement the traditional census records. This was just in Pennsylvania. And they list, again, kind of your taxable inhabitants. So you don't get everyone who's living in a township. But the 1800 and 1807 censuses do have a section at the end of them where they show enslaved persons. And they do, again, it depends on the township and the census taker. Sometimes they just list the number of enslaved persons in an area. Sometimes they list their name and who enslaved them and how old they are. So we do get a little bit more of that personal details and human story from those records. Where we get a really human story is business records. So these are both examples from the iron industry, which, as I kind of alluded to, was very important, especially in the Pottstown, Pottsgrove area. Thomas Rudder actually built the first iron forge in Pennsylvania on the Manatawny Creek all the way back in 1716. So this region very quickly became a hub of industry. So, outreach from Philadelphia coming up into essentially the country at the time. I mean, it still is a very rural area, but you get this industrial hub very early. So there were a couple prominent iron families, Thomas Rudder, the Potts family, the Mayberry family. These are names that you'll see kind of repeatedly in the records, but there were a number of forges, not just at Pottsgrove, but at Colebrookdale and kind of what is now the Boyertown area. You get a forge at Green Lane. There's one at Hereford. There's one at Salford. So there's throughout, and this runs, like I said, the earliest one was 1716, but well past the Revolution, these forges are still continuing to operate as a major economic center. And iron is a very labor-intensive industry. So this was one of the areas where you see kind of the highest numbers of enslaved persons working in a particular industry because it was so labor intensive. And a lot of times enslavers would seek out Africans who had African ironworking knowledge that they could bring with them. So this is an example of skilled labor. So oftentimes you'll see records of the time will refer to what they call iron plantations. This is very different than Southern plantation labor. This is not huge populations working the fields. This is, when I say larger populations, maybe a dozen or so enslaved persons doing highly skilled labor, highly dangerous labor at an iron forge in order to produce this industrial good, especially for the revolution. And we get really interesting kind of human glimpses in these records. The first is a transportation ledger from Pottsgrove Manor. And you can see at the bottom here, a man named Negro Tom actually signed his mark on this record. So Tom would have been in charge of transporting iron either between a forge and furnace or completed work, like produced goods to markets in, let's say, Philadelphia. So Tom was given a lot of responsibility to travel on his own and trusted that he would come back to work, not run away. And so you can see in this ledger, he is signing to show that he did essentially what he was told to do and took the iron. You also get these more transactional stories. So the ledger from Green Lane Forge here shows a man named Negro Thomas being paid for his work. So we can assume, because especially he's being paid cash, that Thomas is likely a free man who is working alongside, as you can see the names here, a number of white colleagues and being paid the same as them in 1797. And then you can also see, because the forges had tended to have company stores essentially, that Tom is then spending his money to buy beef at the company store. And so you kind of get this more daily life. You're not just reducing someone to their labor or how they're valued on a tax list. You actually get Tom is buying beef, and that's what he's eating that week. And we see these, especially in Pottsgrove, Colebrookdale. Justin Clement at Pottsgrove Manor has been really great in providing me scans of a number of forge books that they have at that site. And I've transcribed pretty much any record that I can find that has somebody that clearly marks them as an African, because again, a lot of these people weren't born. They were born in Africa and brought over, or an African-American, the second, third generation. Both free and enslaved persons were given credit at these company stores. So an enslaved person working at Colebrookdale may have worked overtime or worked on a Sunday or worked on a holiday and been given some credit to use at the company store. And you can see these people buying things like new shoes or bacon, luxuries that they would not have been provided on an everyday basis, but because they worked above and beyond kind of what was expected, they're then earning that credit and being able to have some sort of agency in their lives and how they're choosing to live. We also see in timesheets and time records, a man named Negro Ishmael is essentially being told off because he took half the day off to plant potatoes on his own plot that he had kind of adjacent to the plant iron furnace, because even though this is a big industrial kind of operation, there's still pretty much all of these iron masters have farms and agricultural labor that they're performing in addition to the iron works. And because iron is a seasonal production, kind of in the off season, you're also planting and supplementing that income. But Negro Ishmael had his own plot and he took the afternoon to plant potatoes for himself. And so in the time book, he is marked off as being absent from forge work that afternoon. So you really get that human story of what is he doing on this particular day? And you can see he chose his own plot and his own livelihood over the industrial work that he was expected to be performed. And sometimes you'll see Negro Ish is being credited for work that his wife is doing. So his wife might have been doing some spinning or harvesting flax or other things around the area. So we know that Negro Ish has a wife. And so you kind of start to pull these pieces together. Each individual entry, it's like, okay, well, that's what he's doing on one day. But when you put them all together, you really get a sense of somebody's life. And so that's why these are really, really valuable records. Another really valuable record for getting a sense of somebody's life is church records. So enslaved persons were either given time off on Sundays to go to church or specifically brought to church. So Mr. Mayberry, again, an iron plantation owner, his enslaved man named Isaac, who is from Ethiopia, as you can see, and his wife are being baptized in the Faulkner Swamp Reformed Church. We cannot tell whether Isaac kind of believed in the Reformed faith or if he was simply expected to go through this process by Mr. Mayberry, but we get a moment in his life outside again of his labor or his economic value, so-called. And we know that Isaac has a daughter, and she's baptized Maria Catherine, a very German-sounding name. So kind of that cultural assimilation that he's being expected by his enslaver to give his daughter a German name as she's baptized. And we get marriages. Also, Faulkner Swamp Reformed Church. A man named David Evans, his mulatto, so a mixed race person named James, is getting married to Jacob Krause's mulatto of Long Swamp. We don't know James's wife's name, but we know that they got married. And so we kind of see this relationship. And it's interesting, we note that Jacob Krause is from Long Swamp, so how is James getting to see his wife? Is he given leave to go see her? Or clearly they have two different enslavers, so they're likely not living together, which is really heartbreaking when you think about it. But we get this picture of somebody's life. These records are not super common in the church records, but they are there. And oftentimes we see more so marriage and baptismal records rather than kind of everyday communicant records of like who's attending on any given Sunday or who's taking communion. So it's interesting that we get more of these kind of special life events, indicating that perhaps these people weren't expected to go to church every week, but in some way they were expected to, on some level, take part in these white religious rituals. Another type of church record that we get is Quaker meeting minutes. As I mentioned, Quakers were known for very early protesting against enslavement, but many Quakers were also enslavers. Yet another example of Mr. Mayberry, an English Quaker who's a iron forge owner. These records are very difficult to read, but are actually manumission records. So it was not until 1778 that he is being pressured by the Quaker Church to manumit his enslaved persons. And Mr. Mayberry did this gradually. A lot of times he, especially younger children that he enslaved, would make provisions to manumit them when they were 21 years old rather than right away. So you get really valuable information. You can see whether it was pressure from the church or his own kind of ethical, spiritual change. Mr. Mayberry is making a choice here to free his enslaved persons pre-1780 Gradual Abolition Act, yet he's still doing it gradually, making, rules or provisions for when these people are freed. Another really interesting life story comes from newspaper advertisements. So enslaved persons, although somebody like Negro Tom, like you saw in the Iron Forge records, was trusted to leave and go off independently to Philadelphia and transport pig iron. Obviously, not everyone who was given the freedom to do that came back. Many times enslaved persons ran away and sought their own freedom because they weren't being given to it. They were not being given it. And these are one of the most in-depth records that we get as far as visualizing an enslaved person. You get very often physical descriptions. For example, Joe is 33 years of age, 5 feet 2 inches high, with round shoulders, walks lame, and lost one of his little fingers. And his enslaver, Hugh Cousty, we have no record of what Hugh looked like, but we know what Joe looked like. And so that's really kind of a powerful image that obviously Hugh, when he put this advertisement out that Joe ran away from Skipback Township, didn't really expect, I'm sure all these years later, that we would be getting a picture of Joe and not a picture of what Hugh looked like. We also know that Joe ran away with a jean coat, a pair of pantaloons of clouded velvet, waistcoat, half boots, a felt hat, So we know what he was wearing, and we can kind of reconstruct these outfits, whether this is what Joe might have worn on a daily basis or clothes that Joe stole and took with him as he was leaving. We don't know, but we get these very vivid descriptions. And we know that Joe is supposedly strolling about Philadelphia. So we know where he went. He may have had connections there. There was a large free Black population in Philadelphia at the time. So very often we think of runaway enslaved persons, specifically from the South, coming up through the Underground Railroad to Canada. But most of the records that I've seen, especially from this time period, the enslaved person is suspected to be in Philadelphia. So they're not going north. They're actually going south from here. And whether it be they have friends or family in the city, or they just know that there's a larger free Black population, so they're more likely to blend in and not be caught and returned. Additionally, at the time, Quakers founded the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So if you could get to Philadelphia and find kind of that aid, then a lot of times they would raise money to either pay and essentially purchase somebody's freedom for them, or raise a legal case of if you thought you had a case of why you shouldn't be enslaved, that this person didn't actually have the right to enslave you. Quakers would take those cases and often very successfully advocated for people's freedom. You'll actually see when I talk about findings, a very interesting case of that with a man named Gideon Moore. But not all of our newspaper advertisements are runaway ads. We also see enslaved persons being sold and traded as property. So Mr. Mayberry, William Mayberry at this point, another member of the family, has two young men that are by trade forgemen and are sold. This says for no fault of their own, but he has more enslaved persons of that calling than he currently needs. So we see how much that skilled labor is valued in the marketplace. And he says these men are being sold for no fault of their own, but he has too many of them. So we don't know if these men have families with Mr. Mayberry that they're being sold away from, or why he chose these two men in particular. We don't even know their names, but it is another interesting piece of the puzzle that when we piece it together, we can look at what William Mayberry is doing in November of 1763 and try to figure out who these men are. You can also do this research for yourself. So both newspaper.com and the Library of Congress Chronicling America project have free access to online resources with a number of ads that are searchable. So newspapers.com, you normally need a subscription, but for this project, you have free access. And you can, as you can see, I kind of put up the search terms. If you're curious, you can search by location, age, even something like height, and find advertisements for enslaved persons running away from any number of given areas across the country. And same thing with Library of Congress. And again, because these are digitized records, they're not perfect. Sometimes your search terms are not transcribed correctly. So this is not a perfect resource, but it is an incredible resource that we have such a database of records that you can go and search on your own. And then last but not least, I wanted to mention secondary sources. So everything I've talked about so far, as you can see, was from the mid 18th, early 19th century of what was happening at the time that somebody recorded. Secondary sources are somebody else's perspective coming in after the work that I'm doing today, synthesizing data. So these can be an incredible resource for telling underdocumented and underheard stories because somebody else can be providing context. So even though there might not be a lot of work written about Coalbrookdale Forge, there might be written about the iron forges in Reading, and you can understand kind of a better idea of how that economy and that system functioned and use that context to better understand what was happening here. So these are just a number of different sources that I used throughout the project. The Daughters of the American Revolution did an excellent project trying to identify African-American and Native American soldiers during the Revolutionary War. As you've noticed, I kind of put the Revolutionary War as a center point in this talk and then proceeded to not really talk about the revolution at all. So I used both that database as well as trying to do some own work with the primary records of muster rolls as well as pension lists, trying to identify anyone from the Perkiomen Valley who was an African-American soldier, and was unable to find any. I'm guessing this is probably for a number of reasons. One, this is very difficult work to do. Oftentimes in the muster rolls, an individual will not be identified by race. So it's very difficult to tell based on name alone whether somebody was a white man or an African-American man serving in that army. Another reason is because, as I mentioned, iron is a crucial resource. You're fighting a war. You need all of that industrial labor you can get. And so enslaved persons were needed at the iron forges and furnaces, and production was increased during the war. So even a lot of the white men in the area stayed home on the home front during that war rather than joining the Continental Army. So I couldn't find any in the area. That doesn't mean there weren't any. Again, like I said, this research is ongoing. So somebody could email me next week and say, well, I heard you say, and prove me wrong. So want to be clear that this is an ongoing project, but really some incredible resources out there. And then there's also these kind of in-between sources like the Perkiomen Region Past and Present, which is a publication from the late 1890s that gives stories that are local, essentially lore. So it's not what's happening at the time, but it's also not how historians are thinking of it now. So it's kind of this in between, a lot of stories that have been passed down orally. So it's a great starting point to see, oh, well, somebody said at some point there were enslaved persons living in this area. Let's go and see if we can find them in the primary sources and see if this account is correct. For example, there was a story in that publication about an enslaved woman who burned down her owner's house because she was angry at not being given a dress that she was promised. Well, when you go to the primary sources, it actually turns out that was an indentured German servant, not an enslaved Black woman. So seeing how these stories get twisted over time and then going to the primary records and actually being able to correct them and tell a more complete and accurate stories. But there are also some leads in there that did turn out to be correct. So take everything with a grain of salt and check your primary sources. Now, this is probably the part everyone's a little bit more interested in, is what did I actually find throughout this project? So I was able to identify 212 African and African Americans by name. So this is not everyone that I identified, this is everyone who was able to identify, whether it be just a first name or a first and last name. Of those 212 people, 67 were free, 121 were enslaved, of which 34 were either manumitted or able to purchase their freedom after a certain amount of time. And 24 had unclear freedom status, which means they show up in the records, perhaps oftentimes at the iron forges and furnaces. You can tell that they have that kind of credit debit relationship, but it's unclear whether they're being paid as a free worker or it's that kind of enslaved overtime relationship. The records just aren't clear as to what's happening there. So 24 who were unsure what their freedom status was. There are 118 enslavers across the township studied and 150 unnamed free people of color, so from those census records living in 97 predominantly white households. And this is definitely statistically undercounted. As I mentioned with almost every source, there's reasons why people are missing and not showing up from the records. So as far as over that 100-year span of who is living in this area, these numbers are likely much higher, but really hard to tell how much higher. And then here's some other key facts or key findings that are interesting. So enslaved persons lived in every township studied except Towmenson. But why might this be? Is this because Towmenson truly had no enslaved persons living there, or did the tax records in that area, were the tax assessors lazy and not include them or think that that was important? We don't know for sure, so we can't definitively say, oh, there were no enslaved people living here. We can say there were likely not, but it's very difficult to say. 47 of the 212 Africans and African Americans I identified were women. Again, why might this be? It's very much possible that male labor was more valued. In fact, you can see in will and probate records or tax records when the value of an enslaved person is being assessed that men were often assessed for much higher rates and were considered more valuable labor. However, men are also much more likely to appear in the records. So at a census record, unless a woman is living alone or with very young children, a man is going to be named the head of household. Even a son as young as 16 is going to be considered the head of household over his mother. So men show up more. Men show up more in the iron records because they're the ones working the furnaces every day, kind of in those more what we consider important logs of where is iron going and what's happening to it. Whereas women would have been living alongside the men there, but they may have been doing domestic chores or work that's not being given the same value in that credit and debit company store kind of system. So they're not showing up in the records as much. You see a lot of unnamed women in the records. Like I mentioned, the Colbrook Dole Furnace, Negro-ish, his wife is mentioned in the records, but only ever as his wife. So we don't get her name. So again, women are being undercounted. When you look at things like the church records, you tend to see a much more equal distribution of men and women. But again, in that case of James and his wife, we don't know his wife's name. So again, they're just not being counted the same. So there likely were more men, but probably not that same split. And 95 of the 118 enslavers only enslaved one person. So this could be due to cost. It was very expensive to own an enslaved person. You had to purchase them, and then you had to feed them, provide them clothing, shelter, care for them. Indentured servitude, indentured servants were much cheaper because it was a cheaper initial upfront cost, and then after 7, 8 years, they're gone and you don't have to be responsible for them anymore. You're not raising their children. You're not caring for them when they're at the end of their life and they're older and can't perform as much labor for you. So it could be due to the cost. It could be there was no southern plantation economy in the Perkiomen Valley. All of your farms are much more smaller, subsistence farming. You're probably, your family plus 1 or 2 other hands could very well sustain your farm. And then, of course, as I mentioned, though, there's also a consistent undercounting of your enslaved population. So while only 2 people may show up in a tax record, those 2 people may be parents of a much larger family that is not being taxed. So we can say that around 80% of enslavers likely only had 1, maybe 2 enslaved persons. However, that's not always going to be the case. And of course, the iron forges had many more. On a bigger picture, I was curious as to what the breakdown of what does our enslavers look like. So there's this kind of idea that people think Pennsylvania Germans weren't enslavers, that, oh, that was just the Englishmen, or especially, okay, maybe some of the church Germans, Lutherans and Reformed were enslavers, but certainly not the Mennonites or the Schwenkfelders. Well, we found 3 Schwenkfelder names. So again, Schwenkfelder heritage at least, and then 1 Mennonite who were enslavers in the study. As you can see, those Lutheran and Reformed do make up a significant chunk. I'm guessing the Reformed is slightly higher than the Lutheran just because the Reformed Church had better records for me to look at. So I think, because I said over half, I was unable to identify their religious affiliation. So I think if we were to get answers for those half, you would see the rest of the circle shift a bit. But Quakers are only counting for just under 12% of the enslavers in the Perkiomen Valley. So there was not obviously a huge Quaker population. It is a much more German population, with those Reformed Lutheran populations being much higher, but Pennsylvania Germans are certainly not exempt. And then looking at the occupation of enslavers. So we can't always identify exactly what labor an enslaved person is doing, but we can see what their enslaver is doing, and they're likely doing the same thing. So again, this idea, because there wasn't plantation economy, farmers are likely poor, that there weren't individual farmers in the area who were enslavers. Well, about 20% of the people we studied were farmers. An additional 11% were involved in some kind of agricultural industry. So they might have owned a farm and also had a mill. Might have been a miller, or might have owned a distillery. that iron industry, which I kept referring to as so much of the population, 12% of our enslavers were associated with the iron industry. So they obviously had many more enslaved persons than the average farmer, but they're not a huge chunk of the population that they're the only ones who are owning enslaved persons. Other industries make up a good chunk. So this is your cordwainers, your blacksmiths, trades. So this is your shopkeepers, your innkeepers, and then this kind of professional class, your clergy, your lawyers, your doctors. You think of them as the much wealthier kind of population that you might think those are kind of the only people in the area who are owning enslaved persons. They are certainly a chunk. There's probably much less than 4% of the population is involved in those industries. So probably overrepresented as far as where they are in the general population versus how many of them are enslavers. But it is a fairly robust distribution. And again, about a third, we can't identify their occupation. So likely many more farmers, as well as probably many more in all of these areas. And then I wanted to share some more of these kind of human stories. So the first one that I was really interested in was this Moravian school known as the Friedrichstown Kinderanstalt in Frederick Township at the home of Henry Antes. So this is obviously not from the 1700s, this photo, but that is his farm and his home. So this school operated from 1745 to 1750. And the Moravian Church operated throughout Pennsylvania a number of boarding schools for both boys and girls. This one was specifically for boys. So the Moravians at this time were under a communal economy in Bethlehem and would send church members out to various areas to do missionary work. So there were schools in Ole, in Nazareth, kind of throughout Pennsylvania. So Henry Antes was like, here, you can use my farm as a school for boys. And what I thought was really interesting about this school is during that 5-year period, there were a number of Black mixed race students and teachers. So record here on the left is in German. This is just a list of who is pupils at the school in 1747. And you see Bastian, a Black child from St. Thomas. So he's being brought from the Caribbean to Pennsylvania as a Moravian, and the Moravians from Bethlehem are sending him to this school. Bastian was joined by a number of classmates. Ari, a young mixed-race student who arrived from Rio de Berbice, which is present-day Guyana. Benjamin, the young son of a free Black Moravian brother sent from the school in Nazareth. Abraham, a young student enslaved by a justice in Lancaster who was being sent to the school. And Manuel, a 6-year-old student who unfortunately died shortly after arriving at the school. And these boys had a Black teacher as well, a man named Anthony, who was sent from Bethlehem with his Native American wife, Elizabeth, to teach the boys at the school. And they had Native American classmates and white classmates as well. And so you often hear, especially in the South, oh, enslaved persons weren't allowed to be taught to read. Well, while some Southern colonies and later states did pass laws like that, Pennsylvania never had a rule that enslaved persons couldn't be taught to read. They also never had a law that free Blacks couldn't own property. So you see these boys are being educated along with their white peers. Daily records from the school show that relatively equal treatment. When Bastian received a pair of shoes, so did his white classmates. Their education was likely the same. Moravian Church is a very complicated relationship with enslavement. I'm not an expert on it. If you want to learn more, look up the work of Scott Gordon at Lehigh University, who does much better job of kind of explaining the complicated relationship of the Moravian Church owning enslaved persons, but considering them spiritually equal, oftentimes kind of an indifference to that legal status of slavery. So it's very complicated, but Bastian and his classmates were a mixture of white students, free Blacks, enslaved Blacks from whether privately owned, such as Abraham, who was owned by a justice in Lancaster, or Manuel, who was likely owned by the Moravian Church in some form. But the school only lasts 5 years. So I really just wanted to note that it happened in Montgomery County. It was here in this area that we're studying. And then it kind of goes away. Henry Antes had a falling out with the Moravian Church and essentially was like, nope, can't use the property anymore. So the school was dissolved. Boys were sent back up to Bethlehem, to Nazareth, to Ole. And we don't really get the rest of their stories, but their stories do continue. Moravian Church has a practice of Lebenslofts, or essentially a diary keeping, and you get somebody's supposed to be your spiritual journey, but you also get some of that day-to-day life as well. So there is a wealth of Moravian records that, if you're interested in kind of more of the story of what happens when they leave the Perkiomen Valley, it's certainly out there for you to look up. And like I said, Scott Gordon has done excellent research. And if you look up his work, both he does talks that you can see on YouTube, or some of his articles that he's written will kind of fill in some of those details. Many people in this area are familiar with the story of Gideon Moore. When I started this project, this was pretty much the only story that we kind of had an idea of. Everyone was like, oh, have you seen this? Have you heard about this? So for those of you who haven't seen or heard of it, I'm going to try to very briefly tell Gideon and his wife Jenny's very complicated story. So the story for Gideon kind of starts in 1761. He is enslaved by Minister George Michael Weiss of the Reformed Church, he and his wife Jenny. In 1761, George Michael Weiss dies without a will. So Gideon and his family are passed to his widow, Anna, who continues to live on the church parsonage in Upper Hanover Township. In 1764, Anna, she's a little bit smarter. She makes a will. And in her will, she declares that after she dies, Gideon and his family are to be freed. She wants the family to stay together. So she says they can be hired out to pay debts from her and George Michael Weiss, but that they are to stay together as a free family. And she bequeaths Gideon a portion of land in Douglas Township that she owns, and the value of the improvements on the parsonage, which is really interesting because Gideon is enslaved while this labor to build up and improve that parsonage land is being done. But she bequeaths him the value of those improvements, as well as, you can see on the map here, that piece of land. After she dies a year later, her executors of her estate don't listen to the wishes of her will. There's a lot of debts that need to be paid, and Gideon, Jenny, and their 9 children make up a large value of that estate. So they are sold off to at least 5 different men. In 1767-ish, this is where it kind of gets messy, Gideon's new enslaver, a man named Leonard Thomas, essentially gets sick of him not cooperating and trying to run away, and says, okay, Gideon, here's a liberty to go, prove your freedom, and essentially just lets him go. So Gideon returns to the parsonage land where he and Jenny have their house. George and Anna had no children, so they were essentially the Weisses' only family, depending on how you look at that relationship. In 1767, Gideon also, we have a record that he becomes naturalized. This is important because it lets us know, A, Gideon was not born in the colonies. He was born either in Africa, as the name Gideon Moore implies, likely Northern Africa, but he also could have been born in the Caribbean. Either way, he knows the legal value of naturalization, especially in order to own that land that he was given in Anna's will. We also know that in 1768, the church attempts to remove Gideon from the property so they can install a new pastor in that land, and sues Gideon for trespassing. Well, Gideon countersues for trespasses and for the value of those improvements he made on the land with the aid of Philadelphia Quakers. There's a long, ongoing, very messy legal battle. We know that by 1774, Gideon and Jenny do move to Philadelphia and are no longer on that land in Upper Hanover, nor on the land that they were given in Douglas Township. And then in 1777, we know that by this point, at some point, Gideon Moore is given his freedom. He's living with his family in Philadelphia. The Quakers work to buy the freedom of the rest of Gideon's children and reunite the family. But in 1777, Gideon dies, and that was kind of the last record we have of him is this newspaper advertisement for a sale that's happening at the land where he used to live in Philadelphia. So Gideon Moore did not own this dwelling house, but he was well known enough in the city that when the executors of the estate were advertising sale of apple trees and blacksmith shop, that he was put as that kind of recognizable landmark that people would know where they were talking about. So we know that he was prominent in Philadelphia and made a life for himself as a free Black man. He's involved in other lawsuits against prominent Philadelphia merchants. And so we know that he is fighting through the legal system for his freedom, which is a really remarkable story. We have other stories from the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society of Quakers kind of doing legal work to try to help free enslaved persons. But Gideon is really a very strong, headstrong character in this story here that we get, really not wanting to back down for what he's entitled to, that his enslaver gave him in her will. We don't know if Gideon ever lived on this land in Douglas Township. It's possible that one of his children did. And he's next door to see a number of likely white German men, one of whom, Michael Huber, his next door neighbor, is going to be the topic of our next story. So he's living next to an enslaver. So there's likely other free and enslaved Blacks living around him that Gideon knows. Unclear if Gideon knew how to write or not, but he certainly knew the value of the legal system. He knew enough to go seek out his naturalization papers, to contact these prominent Quakers in Philadelphia. And really a remarkable story of a man kind of overcoming a system that is very much stacked against him. So Michael Huber is part of another story that I found really interesting. This is a story of a boy named Paris. So as I mentioned, 1780 is a big year because that's when abolition is passed. 1780 is a big year for Paris. So 1780, Paris is 3 years old at this point. He is enslaved by a man named Adam Hillegas. Adam Hillegas dies in this year, and Paris is sold to his daughter Elizabeth for 94 pounds. So this is Adam Hillegas's will, in which he basically says that his entire enslaved family is to be sold amongst his children. So Paris goes to his daughter Elizabeth. We don't know how many siblings or other family members Paris has, but we know that he is the only one sold to Elizabeth. Well, 1780 is a busy year for Elizabeth too. She gets married to Michael Huber. So Paris now becomes Michael Huber's property because the property would go to the husband in a marriage. And so that's kind of what this middle paper is this unclear. It's some sort of transfer. It appears to be possibly a registration for that 1780 Act that shows that Michael Huber is enslaving him. Frederick Hillegas, another member of the family, is kind of writing this. And then you see that 1820 date on the bottom. So that is essentially a note from the courts in Philadelphia saying that this is a copy made in 1820 of this 1780 record. So this is not the original record. And then the next big story we get is 1828. So 1780, we know Paris is 3 years old, goes through all these transfers, and then 48 years later is the next mention of him in Michael Huber's will. And he makes a really interesting provision in his will, in which he says that he gives Paris to his son Jacob, should Paris ever return. And in 1829, he makes another will with the same provision about Paris. So we know that Paris is no longer there in 1828, 1829, when he is now in his 40s. But what happened in that gap of time between then? We can assume that 1820, when this middle record is being pulled, is likely when Paris runs away, because Michael Huber would need proof as he's advertising to get Paris back that he did register Paris, he legally enslaves him. So that's likely what that record is a copy in 1820 when he's like needing proof of this in order to try to advertise to regain Paris. But we don't know what happens. Michael Huber dies. Paris is nowhere to be found. He doesn't come back, so we can hope that he escaped to some sort of freedom. We don't know where he would be, if it's Philadelphia, if he went elsewhere, if he was able to find the rest of his family that he was sold away from. We don't know, but I thought this was a really remarkable story because Paris is so young when we first see him, and then we get a glimpse of him all these years later, knowing that something happened to him and he's no longer with his enslaved family. That's pretty much all of my early findings. As I said, we have a lot of work more to do. I plan to go to the historical site of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, or historical site of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia soon to look at some more records there. There's, even in the stories that I did tell where we have a lot of information, many more questions than answers. So continuing to do this work, and we are looking for support and funding to do an exhibit based on this work. So we're hoping to hear from the Philadelphia Funder Collaborative, but don't know yet about grant status. But I'm here till the end of May, continuing to do research. There'll be a research report that'll live over in the library across the hall. So much more to come. Stay tuned. Now, are there any questions? The Hillegas family lived in Upper Hanover Township. And then the Hubers were in Douglas Township. So kind of interesting that same move as Gideon Moore from Upper Hanover to Douglas. Yes.
The Henry's farm,
Mhm.
is that the same one that's owned by the Ashmonacan Historical Society?
Yep, it's the same farm. Scott Gordon. Yep, Gordon. And he's in the English department at Lehigh.
It's not a question, it's a comment, it's well done.
Oh. Cute. Yes.
I have a detailed PowerPoint presentation about the Gideon Moore story.
Yes.
To the New Ashmonacan Church, if anybody is interested.
Yes, I tried to do an abbreviated version of the story because you could talk about Gideon and Jenny for a whole hour.
Work to try to intersect it with their genealogy work and see if ancestor in their line.
Not that I know of, but if anyone is interested in doing that work, please feel free to contact me and I will do my best to help. Yes. Jacob Krause owned an enslaved person who we don't in the Faulkner Swamp Reformed Church records, you have Jacob Krause's mulatto of Long Swamp. So we don't know this mulatto woman's name, but we know she married a man named James.
Well, thank you very much. And when you were saying about genealogy, one of the hopes with this project is that all of the research Emma's done will prevent anybody else from having to do the laborious task of going through all those tax records. And it will be living here, and a copy will be at the Historical Society of Montgomery County. So then, for instance, genealogists would have access to it. Well, thank you very much.
That's good. I looked up at the clock and it was like,
Yeah. Yes.